Hi, my name is Amy Ossett Roan, and this is the face behind Ossett Images Photography. And today I'm coming to you from my beautiful backyard, sharing with you some tiny tips to help you understand your camera better and so that you can start to play with those buttons. And you don't have to shoot on auto all the time. So if you want to shoot in manual, you'll be choosing everything that you do, your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. So I'm going to talk about those three things today. So let's talk about your ISO first. The ISO is basically your camera's film speed. So even though we're in the day of mostly shooting digital, it's still a great way to judge how fast your film is going to be. So if you're shooting outdoors, like today here in my backyard, depending on where I have someone in the shade or in the sun, I would probably choose somewhere between 200 or 640 to do some things here in the backyard. If I were going to be indoors and the light is not as good, then I would want to bump my ISO up to maybe 800 or 1200 or 1600 and maybe push it all the way up to like 2500. Sometimes you have to watch ISO numbers because the quality then of your images is degraded, and the pictures will come out a little bit with more noise or grain. And so go ahead and take some images where you're pushing it a little bit, and then take a look and see so that you know kind of what your camera's limits are. The next thing I want to talk about is your aperture. Now the aperture, if you think about your camera, it has an eyeball that lets in light, and within that eyeball that lets in light, that would be the pupil. So the aperture, or your f-stop, is your camera pupil. And if you are in a well-lit area, it's just like going to the eye doctor and getting your eyes dilated. You got to wear sunglasses after that happens because your pupils are really dilated and you go out in the bright sun and you can't see anything. So that's what happens inside your camera. If you have a wide aperture. Now, this is where it gets confusing on the aperture, or they're backwards. So if you think of a wide aperture, or an aperture that's going to let a lot of light in, if you're in a low light situation, then you're going to want a small number, like a 2.8, 3.5, 1.8, somewhere down in there. If you're outside and the sun is bright and maybe you're shooting a landscape or just some people out in the sun, then you're going to want to make that aperture smaller. So you're going to want a larger number, like maybe 11, 15, 18, something up in there. So that's how much light your camera is letting in through the pupil. Your shutter speed, that's where it really gets fun too. Because that's how that's your camera's blinking system. So if your camera is blinking slowly, then you're going to get some motion blur. So if you set your camera and shoot it at a 1/60th or 1/50th or 1/30th, then you're going to probably get some motion blur, which that can be really fun, especially if you're shooting out on the street and you're wanting to get the motion of the cars or headlights. Those are really fun to capture those headlights as kind of a long light trail type of a thing. Then that's where you're going to want to set your shutter speed slower. This was going to be like a Dr. Seuss riddle or tongue twister thing. So, um, the other thing you can do with your shutter speed is, like if you're shooting things and you want to, make sure you stop the motion and freeze the motion, then you're going to have it higher. So you're going to have it like at 1 in 250th or 1 in 500th, something like that. When you make adjustments with one of those three components, in order to get the right exposure, you need to adjust the other two. So let's say you're wanting to shoot something and get some motion blur. So you set your shutter speed for like 1/30th, and then you may set your aperture at like 11 or 18. And then you're going to want to set your ISO smaller, like keep it down around 400 or so, maybe even slower. in order to get some blur. And when you adjust those things, then sometimes even with your street photography, if you slow your shutter speed down enough, you can actually make things disappear. Like if you have people and you want to kind of make the street disappear or be empty of people, you can make those kinds of adjustments. In those cases where you're shooting at a slow shutter speed, you'll want to use a tripod because the the action of even you breathing and pressing down the shutter button to take the picture, there's a lot of movement there. And if your camera's blink is staying open for a longer period of time, any kind of movement, it's going to pick up on that. So I think those are my tiny tips for you today. We talked about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So if you have any questions about those three things or anything else, or you want to share with me some of your photos that you've decided to try to get some motion blur on, and we'll maybe talk about that more specifically in another tiny tip. But for now, let's start with that. And I hope you've enjoyed spending time with me here in my backyard, and I look forward to seeing you next time.